welcome back. Settle in. Pull the darkness around you like a cloak. You are not going to need light where we are going tonight, in fact. Light in certain corridors of the place we are about to discuss has been known to behave rather badly, to bend, to refuse, to simply stop, as though it, too, had learned that some knowledge is best approached with extreme caution. Tonight we descend. We descend 9 floors beneath the Ministry of Magic, past the levels of the Aura Office and the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, past the courtrooms where the fate of witches and wizards has been decided for centuries, down to a floor that officially barely exists, a floor that does not appear on the Ministry's internal maps, not because it was forgotten, but because the people who work there decided, quite deliberately, that the rest of the world should not know where they are or what they do. The Department of Mysteries. Even the name is a kind of small masterpiece of obfuscation. Other departments announce themselves with a degree of transparency. The Department of Magical Transportation, the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. These names tell you what they do. The Department of Mysteries tells you only what it won't. It doesn't say the Department of Forbidden Research, or the Department of Things that could unmake reality. It says only that there are mysteries here. Mysteries that belong to no one. Mysteries that are being kept. What we do tonight is attempt to pull the curtain back, however briefly, on that cold black corridor and the 6 extraordinary chambers beyond. We will trace the origins of this place, not from the day the Ministry of Magic was formally established in 1707, but from decades before, when a handful of brilliant, reckless, ungovernable magical scholars decided that someone needed to study the things no one else dared touch. We will walk through every room. We will speak plainly about what lives in those rooms, what has been done in them, and what catastrophes those experiments have produced. We will examine the darker architecture of this place, the experiments on Obscurus, the research conducted on Dementors, the lines the Unspeakables crossed with such magnificent indifference. And we will, at the end, lift our eyes and ask, how does the rest of the magical world handle knowledge, this dangerous? The answer, as you will discover, is not well. But let us begin at the beginning. Part 1. Before the Ministry. The origins of the Unspeakables, 1672 to 1707. The year is 1672. England is a country in the grip of a very particular tension. The statute of secrecy is not yet law. It is still 5 years from ratification. But the conversation about whether the magical and muddle communities should permanently separate has been grinding on for decades, with the slow, agonizing friction of a millstone. Persecution of witches and wizards, both genuine and mistaken, is at its peak. The Salem witch trials are still 20 years away, but their spirit, that particular human impulse to purify through accusation and fire, is already in the air. In this climate, a loose gathering of scholars came together, not a government, not a council. There was no government to belong to yet. They were simply researchers, witches and wizards of extraordinary ability and almost total social invisibility, who had been, quietly, for years, studying the things that other magical scholars agreed were too dangerous, too destabilizing, too philosophically uncomfortable to pursue formally. Their names are almost entirely lost to history. This is not an accident. They erased themselves from the records because they reasoned the work was more important than the workers, and because a named scholar could be found, subpoenaed, pressured, killed. Anonymity was not cowardice. Anonymity was methodology. What we know, pieced together from oblique references in ministry founding documents, from fragments of correspondence discovered in the personal library of Hephzibah Smith, and from a single extraordinary journal entry attributed to one of the founders of modern British wizarding governance, is that this group called themselves, with characteristic understatement, the Inquirers. Elsewhere in the fragments, a single Latin phrase appears, sin namen, meaning without name. It is possible, and some historians of magic find this deeply satisfying, that the word unspeakable derives not from a directive about secrecy, but from this original philosophical commitment to namelessness. To speak something, in the most ancient magical traditions, is to give it power and identity. The Unspeakables chose to be, from the beginning, people who could not be spoken of. Their early work was scattered, dangerous, and largely theoretical. They were interested in the boundaries, not the rules that wizarding society imposed on magic. The ministry's regulations and the Wizengamit's decrees were not yet in existence, but the actual, structural, physical boundaries of what magic could do and what it could not. Where did it come from? What was it at its absolute core? What did it touch in the universe that Muggle science would, 300 years later, still be unable to detect? And what happened at the edges? What happened in the places where magic interfaced with things it was not designed to interface with? Death, for instance. Time, love, consciousness, space. These were their questions. And here is the thing about questions like these. The thing that the Unspeakables understood from the very beginning. Questions like these do not get answered. They get deepened. You pull one thread and find 5 more beneath it. You solve one equation and the solution opens a room you didn't know existed. The work was never going to be finished, which meant the department, the institution they would eventually become, was never going to be finished either. When the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy was signed in 1692, and the separate magical governments of the various nations began their slow, formal consolidation, the Inquirers faced a choice. They could join whatever emerging body was crystallizing around them, become official, acquire resources and legitimacy, or they could resist institutional capture and remain what they had always been, unofficial, ungovernable, brilliant, and invisible. They chose, with characteristic cleverness, to do both. When the British Ministry of Magic was formally founded in 1707, the Unspeakables, now operating under that name, were incorporated into its structure. But the terms of their incorporation were, by all historical accounts, extraordinarily unusual. They were given their own floor, their own entrance, their own command structure, which reported nominally to the Minister for Magic but, in practice, reported to no one. Their budget was classified. Their personnel files were sealed. The nature of their research was not disclosed to the rest of the ministry. In exchange, The Unspeakables agreed to make their work available to the Ministry in situations of genuine existential threat, to consult on matters involving the fundamental forces they studied, and to do absolutely nothing else that would bring them into conflict with the government nominally above them. It was, if you step back and look at it clearly, a remarkable transaction. The magical government of Britain had essentially agreed, on its founding day, to permanently house within itself a group of researchers it didn't control, doing work it couldn't evaluate, in a location that it couldn't fully access, on problems that it wasn't entirely certain could be solved. When Minister for Magic Ulick Gamp was asked, in a letter written sometime around 1710, why he had agreed to these terms, his reply was recorded in the ministry's founding correspondence. He wrote with what I find to be commendable honesty, because they were already there, and because whatever they are doing down there, I would rather have it done here, where I at least know which corridor to find it in, than out there somewhere where I cannot. This is the logic that has governed the Department of Mystery's relationship with the Ministry of Magic ever since. And so the department settled into its home. The corridors were built, or, more accurately, were revealed, because there is some architectural evidence suggesting that the space the department occupies predates the ministry building itself, which is itself impossible to date with precision, because it has been expanded, magically modified, and partially rebuilt so many times that its structural core cannot be identified. The department may have been built first. The ministry may have been built around it. No one in current employment knows for certain, and the Unspeakables, characteristically, are not saying. What they built down there, what they arranged, what they organized, what they grew in certain rooms, what they caught in others, were the 6 chambers. Let us visit them. Part 2. The architecture of the 6 rooms. A tour. The entrance to the Department of Mysteries is a plain black door at the end of an equally plain corridor on level 9 of the Ministry of Magic. The corridor is unlit, or rather lit in the way that somewhere very dark is lit by a distant, weak source. You are aware of the absence of darkness more than the presence of light. The floor is polished stone. Your footsteps make sounds that seem too loud. The door has no handle. It opens when it chooses to, for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, which may itself tell you something about the philosophy of the place. Beyond the door is a circular room. All the walls are identical. All the doors are identical. When you enter, the room rotates, slowly, silently, like a thought turning over in a sleeping mind, and you lose your sense of direction. You cannot know which door leads where. You can only choose and step through and discover. This is not poor architecture. This is a statement of purpose. Chamber 1. The Death Chamber. The Death Chamber is a large, dimly lit stone amphitheater. You descend stone steps into it, as though descending into an arena. Though nothing has ever fought here, or at least nothing that we understand to have been combat. At the center of this amphitheater stands a raised stone dais, and on the dais stands the veil. The veil, let me describe it with precision, because precision matters more here than anywhere else in the department. It is an archway, stone-built, ancient, in a way that makes the ministry building around it feel like scaffolding, like something temporary put up recently and waiting to come down. The archway frames a tattered piece of black fabric, the consistency of it somewhere between silk and smoke, moving always in a wind that is not blowing in the room, that is not blowing anywhere in the building, that is not, by any physical measurement, present. Voices come from behind it. Harry Potter heard them. Luna Lovegood heard them. Thestrals, creatures who can only be seen by those who have witnessed death, are visibly disturbed in the vicinity of the veil in a way that they are not disturbed by any other magical object in recorded history. Think about that for a moment. Thestrals are not afraid of death. They are defined by it. They are its companions and its witnesses. For a creature like that to be unsettled by an object suggests the object is doing something to the concept of death that even death's most familiar witnesses find unusual. The veil is not a killing curse. It is not a trap. It is not a weapon the department built or contained. Every line of evidence suggests, and the scholarly consensus among those who have been permitted to publish anything about it agrees, that the veil is a boundary, a membrane, a permanent, stable, enduring interface between the living world and whatever comes after it. The Unspeakables did not create the veil. They built around it. The death chamber was constructed specifically to house something that was already there, already functioning, already receiving whatever it receives. The stone dais and the amphitheater were put in place later. The ministry's frame around a thing they found, not a thing they made. This is important. It means the veil existed before any of the architecture around it, before the ministry, before the statute, before, perhaps, the organized practice of magic as we understand it. The veil may be older than recorded wizarding history by an unknowable margin. What is the veil, precisely? This is the question the death chamber was built to study, and has spent, by conservative estimate, 300 years failing to answer. The Unspeakables know or believe or theorize. The distinction in this room matters enormously, that the veil represents a one-way boundary. Things pass through it in one direction. They do not come back. Sirius Black fell through it in 1996 and did not return. The voices heard through it have never identified themselves, have never responded to questions, have never provided information that could be verified. They are simply there, a murmur, sometimes a whisper, at the furthest edge of perception, suggesting presence on the other side without confirming what that presence is. There is a theory, and I must emphasize that it is a theory, one that the Unspeakables have never confirmed and the ministry has never officially acknowledged, that the veil and the resurrection stone are connected, not in their function, not in their practical magic, but in their origin. The resurrection stone, one of the three hallows, is said to be capable of summoning the dead back across whatever boundary separates them from the living. Not truly, not completely. The dead who appear when the stone is turned are shadows, echoes, something less and other than the people they were. But they are recognizably present. They cross something. The veil crosses the same something from the other direction. If this theory has weight, and I am not prepared to say it does not, Then, what we are looking at in the death chamber is one half of a pair. The resurrection stone reaches across the boundary from this side. The veil opens the boundary from this side. They are not the same mechanism, but they touch the same structure. Albus Dumbledore, the greatest magical mind of the 20th century, who possessed the resurrection stone for years and understood its operation better than almost anyone alive, was observed in multiple witness accounts to approach the veil with what colleagues described as unusual stillness. Not reverence, exactly, stillness, as though he was listening for something and was not certain he wanted to hear it. Dumbledore did not fully understand the veil. This fact alone should tell you something about what the veil is. The Unspeakables study it continuously. They have established that the archway itself is indestructible by conventional means. Several attempts to take samples of the stone for analysis over the centuries have failed, the stone simply refusing to be cut or chipped, the tools breaking against it with no effect. They have established that the fabric, whatever it is, cannot be examined at close range. Researchers who have attempted to touch it have reported immediate, overwhelming sensory disorientation, a sound like a roar and a silence, the sensation of enormous distance, and then nothing. None of these researchers were permanently harmed. None of them could explain what had happened. None of them tried twice. The voices through the veil remain the department's oldest and most studied anomaly. They were recorded as early as 1720. An unspeakable named Elara Voss made the first surviving written record of them, describing them as a susurrus beyond knowledge, both present and absent, speaking without words. She spent 11 years attempting to isolate individual voices from the murmur. At the end of those 11 years, she submitted a report that contained, in its entirety, 4 words. There are too many. She retired shortly afterward and spent the remainder of her life as a gardener in Dorset, growing radishes which she refused to eat. The death chamber is the most visited room in the department by senior ministry officials and the least understood. People go to look at it the way people go to stand at cliffs overlooking the ocean at night, because the scale of the thing adjusts your sense of your own size in ways that are uncomfortable and, somehow, necessary. Chamber 2. The Time Room. If the death chamber unsettles you with its stillness, the time room assaults you immediately with its noise. The room is large and filled, wall to ceiling, with shelves of time turners, or was, before 1996, when a certain sequence of events resulted in nearly the entire collection being destroyed, in a manner that the official ministry account describes, with magnificent understatement, as an unfortunate incident. The sound in the time room, when it was intact, was a constant, complex, layered ticking, not the uniform tick of a single clock, but the overlapping rhythms of hundreds of different temporal instruments, each measuring time slightly differently, each cycling at its own rate, producing a sound that eyewitness accounts describe as music that hasn't decided what it is yet, and the sound of time thinking. At the center of the time room stands the bell jar, and inside the bell jar, endlessly cycling, is a hummingbird, or an egg, depending on when you look at it, or a chick, or an empty sky, or a hummingbird again. The bell jar is time looping, a sealed pocket of recursive temporal experience. and whatever lives inside it has been in that loop for as long as anyone can remember. The hummingbird, if it is the same hummingbird, has hatched and grown and aged and died and returned to its egg an unknowable number of times. It shows no signs of distress. It simply loops. This is what a controlled, small-scale temporal recursion looks like. What an uncontrolled, human-scale one looks like is considerably worse. The story of Eloise Mintumble is one of the most documented disasters in the Department of Mysteries history, and one of the most rarely discussed outside of it. In 1899, the exact date is disputed, though all accounts agree it was late autumn. When the light goes early and the cold comes in earnest, an unspeakable named Eloise Mintumble became stranded in the past. The full details of how this occurred are sealed in a ministry report that has never been released to the public, but the outline is known. She was involved in an experimental temporal transit, something more ambitious and less stable than a standard time-turner reversal, and something went wrong. She was sent, or fell, or was pushed by a catastrophic miscalculation to the year 1402. She survived in 1402 for 5 days. 5 days, an impossibly short time. A period so brief that, in ordinary life, nothing of consequence can occur. You get 5 days, and you can make a short journey, read a short book, begin a new project, or end an old one. 5 days is nothing. For Eloise Mintumble, 5 days in the 15th century meant 5 centuries. When she was retrieved, and the rescue operation alone is described, in the few accounts that touch it, as one of the most complex and costly magical operations undertaken by the department before the 20th century, she had aged, not by 5 days, not by any sane, calculable amount. She had aged 500 years in 5 days, her body attempting to absorb the passage of time between her origin point and her destination. She died shortly after her return, not from any identifiable cause, but from an excess of time, as though the body had simply been given too many years in too short a period, and could not distribute them. But this is not even the worst of what happened. Her 5 days in 1402 had disturbed the timeline in ways that propagated forward across 5 centuries. When she was retrieved, it was discovered that the timeline had responded. 25 people who should have been born in the intervening centuries had not been born. Another 12 who should not have existed did exist, briefly, before the timeline corrected itself in ways that were, by all accounts, deeply unpleasant for those 12 individuals. The department spent 7 years tracking and resolving the temporal paradoxes created by those 5 days. Some of the effects could not be fully resolved, and were, in ministry correspondence, classified under the designation acceptable historical deviation, which is the kind of phrase that sounds bureaucratic and innocuous until you think about what it actually means, which is, we could not fix everything, and some people are different or non-existent or changed because of what happened in those 5 days. Abound, puer de west to side, and we have decided to call this acceptable. The Eloise Mintumble incident is the direct legislative origin of the strict regulations surrounding time-turners, the 5 inviolable laws governing time travel among them. The laws forbidding transit to any point more than 5 hours in the past, using a standard time-turner. The prohibition on temporal transit by anyone under qualified supervision, and the absolute prohibition on deliberately attempting to alter recorded history were all drafted in the immediate aftermath of 1899. The time room's bell jar, the hummingbird cycling endlessly through its existence, was sealed and designated as an in perpetuity demonstration of controlled temporal recursion, to remind every unspeakable recursion, to remind every unspeakable of the precise scale of what they were handling. The time room, before its partial destruction in 1996, also housed experimental devices, temporal measuring instruments, prototypes for time turners with extended range that never passed safety review, and at least one device whose purpose is not recorded in any accessible document and whose appearance, described in a 1971 inventory as a pendulum of impossible weight, swinging without origin, was never adequately explained. What the time room was studying, beneath the technical apparatus, was a philosophical question. Is time a river or an ocean? Does it flow in one direction only? Can it be altered? Does it have structure and edges? Or is it simply everything at once? And all our experience of sequence, an illusion imposed by consciousness, the experiments conducted there, particularly those before the Mintumble disaster, were attempting to resolve this question empirically. They were trying to find the edges of time, the way a child lost at sea might try to find the shore by swimming in every direction. They found the edges. They found them the hard way. Chamber 3, the love chamber, the everlocked room. There is one room in the Department of Mysteries that the Unspeakables have never managed to open with any consistency or any certainty. It stands in the circular entrance corridor, its door distinguished from the others by nothing visible, the same black wood, the same absence of handle, but it is locked, not with magic, exactly, locked in a way that magic cannot reliably address, that picks and spells and even the most powerful unlocking charms merely bounce off of, or sometimes pass through without apparent effect, as though the door understands what you are trying to do and has decided it simply doesn't apply here. The love chamber is not always accessible. This is the most basic and the most baffling thing about it. On certain occasions the Unspeakables have been attempting to predict and catalogue since the department's founding, and have largely failed to anticipate with any precision the door opens. Not because someone unlocked it, but because it chose to be open. The researchers who have entered on these occasions have had varying experiences. Some have described it as warm, some as cold, some as both simultaneously. Some have described hearing music, some silence. All of them have described a force, not a being, not a presence, but a force that was actively present in the room in a way that no other room in the department achieves. Not passive containment, active power. Albus Dumbledore, who studied the Department of Mysteries for decades and consulted with its researchers on numerous occasions, said of the love chamber, "It contains a force that is at once more wonderful and more terrible than death, than human intelligence, than the forces of nature." He was not speaking poetically. Dumbledore was not a man who spoke poetically when he meant literally. He meant that the force contained in that room, whatever its precise nature, was more powerful in its category of effect, in its capacity to change outcomes, to alter the course of events, to work on human beings and human choices than any of the other forces the department studied. The theory, and it is one that has been circulated among wizarding scholars with increasing seriousness over the last century, is that love in the Harry Potter universe is not merely an emotion. Emotions, by definition, live in minds. They are states of consciousness, responses to stimuli, neurological weather. Love, the theory proposes, is something else. Something that exists whether or not anyone is feeling it, the way gravity exists whether or not anything is falling. A physical force, in the most rigorous sense, a property of reality, independent of any single consciousness experiencing it, capable of being encountered, studied, contained, and under certain extraordinary circumstances, wielded. The evidence for this is compelling. The most significant piece of evidence is Harry Potter himself. Lily Potter's sacrifice, her choice to die in place of her infant son, when she could have stepped aside, generated a magical protection, so powerful that the most devastating curse in the wizarding world rebounded entirely off a 15-month-old child. This protection was not a spell Lily cast. It was the residue of a feeling. Dumbledore describes it as ancient magic, which is wizarding code for magic that predates theory. Magic that was operating before anyone understood why. The protection of that ancient magic was not symbolic. It was structural. It physically altered the nature of the space around Harry's body, so that curses aimed at him either failed or returned to their caster. A feeling did that. A choice, rooted in love, generated a physical alteration in the laws of magical causation that persisted for years. This is what the love chamber is studying. Not romance, not the pleasant warmth of affection. The Department of Mysteries is studying whether love is a fundamental force of the universe, present in and affecting reality regardless of individual experience, as real and as physical as time or space. The room is locked because the force inside it is not safe to be around without preparation, not because it will harm you in any direct sense, but because forces of this magnitude affect the mind and the choices it makes, and an unspeakable working on time or space research, who walks through an accidentally open love, true hours inside, might find with Philo, with Palais, Purple, and Purple, with upon emerging, that their priorities have reorganized themselves in ways that are professionally inconvenient. This has happened. It is mentioned in 3 separate unspeakable personnel files. In the delicate ministry shorthand of experience, a period of reorientation, following accidental environmental exposure, the love chamber remains the least understood room in the department, and the one the Unspeakables discuss least. This is not because it is less important than the others. It is because it is harder to study. Death you can watch. Time you can measure. Love resists instruments. Love, whatever it is in this universe, does not submit to calibration. Chamber 4, the space room. The space room is the newest of the 6 chambers in terms of its current configuration. Though newest is relative in a building whose age cannot be established with certainty. It contains a large, bell-shaped glass structure within which the full observable universe exists in miniature. This is not a projection, not a magical painting, not a map. It is a genuine miniaturized cosmological representation, dynamically accurate, updating in real time, showing the movement of stars and galaxies and the slow-burning arcs of cosmic events across billions of light-years of space. Planets orbit in it. Stars explode in it. In miniature, their supernova visible as tiny blooms of light. The Milky Way is a faint smear near the center. Its scale is approximately 1 to a number that does not have a convenient name. The Unspeakables in the space room are studying the relationship between magical space, the space that magic operates in and across, which clearly has properties that differ from the Muggle understanding of physical space and cosmological space. The question they are working toward is whether magical ability and magical phenomena are localized to Earth and its vicinity, or whether magic is a universal property, the way physical laws are universal, present in and operating on galactic scales that no wizard or witch has ever directly observed. Preliminary evidence, gathered over decades of observation, suggests that magic is not geographically universal in any simple sense. The miniature cosmological display in the space room responds to significant magical events in ways that purely physical changes do not. There are documented instances of the display shifting of previously stable configurations, rearranging themselves. In the wake of major magical disruptions, like Voldemort's first defeat in 1981, whether this is a property of the display itself or a genuine cosmological response remains unresolved. What the space room ultimately wants to know is this: where did magic come from? Not in the genealogical sense. We know how magical ability passes through families, how it can appear spontaneously, how it manifests in different individuals with different strengths and signatures. But at the foundational level, what is magic? Is it energy? Is it information? Is it something that the universe generates, the way it generates gravity or electromagnetic force? Or is it something local, something peculiar to this planet, this ecosystem, these specific evolved creatures? The space room is attempting to answer a question that Muggle cosmology is, from a completely different direction, also attempting to answer. They will not, in all likelihood, compare notes. Chamber 5. The Brain Room. The Brain Room is the room that the majority of Ministry employees who have heard of it, but not been inside it, find most immediately disturbing. This reaction is, upon reflection, entirely rational. The room contains a large tank, deep and clear, full of a fluid that is not water. It has water's transparency, but water's is not its only property. It preserves, it suspends, it holds, and floating in this fluid are brains, not labeled, not archived, not presented in any way that suggests they were obtained through any clinical or sanctioned process. They float. They are alive, in some sense that the word alive normally doesn't cover. Alive in the way that a thing can be alive when it is no longer attached to the body that gave it consciousness, it housed, and yet continues to function, continues to benuse, to genuse, to genuse, to genuse, to genuse, to perhaps, to perhaps, to perhaps, to perhaps, perhaps, to perhaps, to hapses, seplepu, or pap of the house of Burg of Potter, how have the brains can read minds. This was discovered early and at some cost. Researchers who come within a certain proximity of the tank find their thoughts affected, not controlled, not overwritten, but annotated, as though the brains in the fluid are commenting on what passes through the mind of anyone nearby. The annotations are not verbal. They are not even precisely cognitive. They are more like a pressure, a weight on certain thoughts, a warmth or coldness that attaches itself to specific mental contents without warning or pattern. The tentacles that extend from the brains when provoked are not the most disturbing feature of the room, though they are the most immediately dramatic. They wrap around limbs and release thought, not the thinker's thought, but the brain's thought, whatever that means for a disembodied brain floating in preservation fluid. And the thought travels up the nervous system with a force that is both physical and cognitive, leaving traces. Ron Weasley sustained injuries from these tentacles in 1996 and reported vivid alien ideation for weeks afterward. The brain room is studying the mind, not the brain as a physical object that is Muggle medicine's territory, but the mind as a magical phenomenon. What is consciousness in a magical being? Is it, like magical ability, an additional property that supervenes on the physical brain, something that the physical architecture allows but does not generate alone? When a witch or wizard dreams prophetically, what is the mechanism? When a legilimens reads another person's thoughts, what are they actually accessing? Is it physical memory encoded in neural tissue, or is it something else? Something that occupies the same space as the physical brain, but is not reducible to it. The brains in the tank are, the Unspeakables believe, experiments in separating mind from matter. What persists when the body is gone, but the brain is preserved and kept active? What is the minimum substrate for consciousness? These are questions that the brain room has been working on for a very long time and has produced considerable data on without anything approaching a satisfying answer. Because the deeper the data goes, the more complex the questions become. This is the nature of the work in the Department of Mysteries. Not convergence toward answers, but deepening into better questions. Chamber 6, the Prophecy Room. The Prophecy Room is the largest of the 6 chambers and the most immediately comprehensible, which makes it, in certain respects, the most treacherous. It looks like a library. It behaves like a library. Long shelves stretch into shadow on every side, each one filled with glass orbs of varying sizes, each orb containing a soft, pale internal light, each labeled with a small slip attached to its shelf. What the orbs contain are prophecies, not reports of prophecies, not transcriptions or recordings. The prophecies themselves, the original prophetic events, preserved and sealed at the moment of their utterance by a process, the Hall of Prophecy, was designed to execute automatically, requiring no unspeakable presence or oversight. When a true prophecy is spoken, something in the magical architecture of the building reaches out and takes it, captures it, wraps it in glass, and adds it to the archive. This has been happening automatically since the room was completed. The shelves go back further than anyone has fully explored. Access to a prophecy is extraordinarily restricted. A prophecy can only be retrieved from the hall by one of the people named within it. Only Harry could retrieve the prophecy about himself and Voldemort, and even then the retrieval had to be physically performed in the room itself. Elsewhere, the glass is cold and inactive. In the room, handled by the right person, the orb warms, and the image inside it stirs and becomes accessible. The system has no exceptions that anyone has found. The Ministry spent decades trying to find exceptions. There are none. The magical architecture of the Hall of Prophecy enforces its own access rules without intervention from any unspeakable, and nothing has been discovered that subverts it. It is, in this sense, the most perfectly secure archive in the wizarding world, not because it is guarded, but because it enforces its own conditions. What the Unspeakables want to understand is the prophetic mechanism itself, not the content of individual prophecies, but the physics or the metaphysics of prophetic knowledge. How does a seer know what they know? Is the future, in some sense, already determined, already present, somewhere that certain minds, with the right configuration, can reach into and read? Or is prophecy generative? Does the act of predicting create the tendency for the predicted thing to occur? The prophecy shaping the will of the people in it, like a groove shaping water, or the Trelawney prophecy about Harry and Voldemort, is a compelling case study for the second model. Voldemort, hearing a fragment of it, made choices based on what he heard, and those choices were directly responsible for creating the conditions the prophecy described. In a very real sense, he caused it, but he only caused it because he believed it was inevitable, which means the prophecy was already shaping reality before anyone fully understood it. This is the paradox at the heart of the prophecy room. The archive is full of knowledge about the future, but accessing that knowledge changes the future. Every interaction with the archive is a temporal intervention. Every prophecy read is also, potentially, a prophecy made more or less likely to come true by the fact of its being read. The Unspeakables who work in this room are aware, acutely, that they are not passive observers. They are participants in every prophecy they touch. Part 3. The Darker Corridors. Forbidden Experiments. Not everything the Department of Mysteries has studied has been recorded, and not everything that has been recorded has been made available to the broader magical public. There is a layer beneath the 6 chambers, a set of research threads that exist in the darkest corners of the department's institutional memory, that the Ministry of Magic has been, with varying degrees of urgency, trying to either seal off or quietly continue depending on the political climate of any given era. Among the most significant of these forbidden threads is the research on Obscurus and Obscurus, for those whose knowledge of the darkest corners of magical pathology is incomplete, is a parasitic magical force, a dark, swirling mass of repressed magical energy that develops within a young witch or wizard who has been forced, through trauma, fear, or external suppression, to repress their magic entirely. The suppression doesn't eliminate the magic. It cannot. The magic is part of the child, structural to who they are. Instead, suppressing it creates a second entity, a shadow, a wound that becomes animate and devastating. Obscurials rarely live past the age of 10. The force consumes them. The Department of Mysteries has studied Obscurials since at least the 18th century. The research is dark for reasons that extend beyond its subject matter. To study an Obscurus properly, you need one. Obtaining a living Obscurial, with the Obscurus still active and the child still hosting it, requires that you locate a child who is in the specific, terrible circumstance of having their magic suppressed, which means either finding children who are already in that situation, or, in the very darkest versions of this research, engineering that situation. There is no evidence in any accessible document that the Department of Mysteries has ever deliberately created an Obscurial. There is also no accessible document that explicitly rules it out, which is a different kind of evidence entirely. What the Unspeakables were interested in, from a theoretical standpoint, was whether the Obscurus, the dark entity itself, separated from its host, could be stabilized, could be contained in isolation from the child who had generated it. Because a free Obscurus, separated from a child, has no known stable existence. It dissipates. But what dissipation means for a magical entity, whether it truly ceases to exist, or whether it disperses into the magical fabric of reality and continues to exist in a distributed form, is precisely the kind of question the Department of Mysteries finds irresistible. The Dementor research represents a different category of darkness. Dementors are not entities that the Department of Mysteries created or captured for study. They are ancient, pre-human, and operate under rules that have nothing to do with human magic in any direct sense. What they are, at the metaphysical level, is a question the wizarding world has been arguing about for as long as it has been in contact with them. The prevailing current scholarly opinion, which has gradually overtaken the older view of Dementors as merely dangerous magical beasts, is that Dementors are personifications, not of death, that's the Veil's territory, but of a particular kind of human suffering. The experience of being near a Dementor is the experience of depression in its most absolute form. The conviction that the world has no light and never had any, that every memory of happiness was a mistake or a lie, that the only real things are suffering and the absence of hope. This is not, incidentally, similar to clinical depression. This is a physical being that causes, by proximity, the subjective experience of severe depressive disorder. Whether Dementors are the personification of this suffering or the cause of it, whether they draw the experience out of their victims or bring it with them from somewhere else, is a question the department has been attempting to resolve for decades. What they have established is that Dementor populations are not static. They grow. They reproduce by a mechanism no one fully understands, but which appears to correlate with concentrations of human suffering in a geographic area. Places that have been sites of long-term suffering, prisons, battlefields, sites of persecution, tend to have higher Dementor populations. Whether the Dementors are drawn there by the suffering, or whether their presence causes the suffering to deepen and linger, is again, a question of cause and effect that the department has been circling for years. The research on Dementors is significant for a practical reason as well as a theoretical one. The Ministry of Magic used Dementors as prison guards at Azkaban for centuries, a decision that is, from the Department of Mysteries research perspective, deeply bizarre. You would not, having studied an entity that operates as a physical personification of despair and that grows stronger in concentrated suffering, choose to place that entity in charge of guarding a large population of suffering people. Unless, of course, the suffering was the point. Unless the Ministry's interest was not merely in containment, but in punishment. And they found in the Dementors a convenient mechanism for a kind of suffering so profound and so automatically self-perpetuating that no guards needed to administer it. The department's own files on Dementors, to the extent they can be inferred from what has leaked into broader circulation over the centuries, appear to reflect significant discomfort with the Azkaban arrangement. Whether this discomfort was ever officially expressed and ignored, or simply remained internal to the department, is not known. There are other, darker threads. Research into the nature of curses, what curses do at the metaphysical level, why they cannot be blocked, but can be redirected, what actually happens to the victim of an unforgiven curse at the moment of impact. Research into the persistence of magical signatures after death, whether a witch or wizard's magical identity can survive the end of their body in any form that could be detected or engaged with. Research into the mechanisms of becoming a ghost. Why some people become ghosts and others do not is not understood. The Unspeakables believe it has to do with will and with the moment of death, with whether the dying mind grabs for the living world or releases it. But the mechanism of that grabbing, the way a disembodied will can retain the ability to interact with physical space, is not explained by any current magical theory. All of this research is ongoing. None of it is comfortable. Most of it will not be completed within any human lifetime, or probably within several human lifetimes. Part 4. The Global Perspective. How other cultures manage dangerous knowledge. The Department of Mysteries is not unique in the sense of being the only institution of its kind. It is unique in the sense of being the most concentrated, the most formally organized, and the most deeply embedded in a national magical government. Other cultures have, in their own ways, developed institutions for handling the same problems. Knowledge that is too powerful to ignore and too dangerous to pursue openly. The comparison with North American magical institutions is instructive, and the contrast with the Salem Witches Institute is particularly sharp. The Salem Witches Institute operates in what historians of magic have described as the longest shadow in the Western Hemisphere, the shadow of the Salem witch trials of 1692. 20 people died in those trials. Most of them were not witches, but some of them were. And the American wizarding community, which in 1692 was operating in an environment of colonial persecution and institutional religious paranoia, suffered casualties in Salem that were not merely tragic but structurally traumatic. They altered the relationship between American wizards and the question of dangerous knowledge in ways that are still visible in institutional design centuries later. The Salem Witches Institute. which was formally established in the decades after the trials, and which became one of the most significant magical educational institutions in North America, has a philosophy that diverges from the British Department of Mysteries in one key respect. It prioritizes protective concealment over active investigation, where the Unspeakables lean forward into dangerous knowledge, study it, contain it, probe it, attempt to understand it, even when understanding carries risks. The Salem Institute tends to build walls around dangerous knowledge, and then build more walls around those walls, and then, ideally, build a mountain on top of that. This is not cowardice. It is a rational response to a specific historical experience. The American wizarding community learned in 1692 that dangerous knowledge held openly or carelessly could be detected, could lead to persecution, could result in the deaths of innocent and magical alike. Their response was extreme concealment, not just of the knowledge itself, but of the entire apparatus of magical society from non-magical observation. The North American Statute of Secrecy was enforced with a rigidity that made the British version look casual. The no-mage interference laws passed in the 20th century by MAC USA. The Magical Congress of the United States of America went significantly further than anything in the British framework, criminalizing magical romantic relationships and social interactions in ways that the British ministry never attempted. This creates a different kind of research culture, where the British Department of Mysteries studies the boundary between life and death. American magical institutions tend to classify anything that might bring magical reality to non-magical attention as the primary threat to be managed. They study security, concealment, containment of information rather than containment of forces. The comparison illuminates something important about the nature of the Department of Mysteries, its existence, and the fact that it was given a home at the center of the British magical government reflects a particular philosophy about what the appropriate response to dangerous knowledge is. The British position, embedded in the department's founding, is essentially, face it, study it. Do not let the things you don't understand pile up in the dark where you cannot see them. Bring them into the department. Put them in rooms. Make sure someone is watching them. This approach carries risk. The risk that watching brings contact, and contact brings change. And change in some of these rooms can be irreversible. But the alternative, looking away, building walls, hoping that what you cannot see will not affect you, is, by the department's institutional logic, worse. The wizarding cultures of East Asia, the magical traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, the shamanic traditions that persist in isolated magical communities in the Americas and Australasia, all of them have developed different answers to the same question. What do you do with knowledge that is too dangerous to ignore and too dangerous to pursue? The answers range from the encyclopedic containment of the Department of Mysteries to the wall building of the Salem Institute, to the integration and transformation strategies of indigenous magical traditions, which tend to argue that dangerous knowledge should not be separated from the human experience of living, but rather woven into it, contextualized, given stories and rituals that make it survivable. None of these approaches is simply right. All of them are responses to real problems, developed by communities that understood, from their own historical experience, what happens when dangerous knowledge is mishandled. The Department of Mysteries approach is merely the one we happen to know most about, and even it, as we have seen tonight, is shot through with unresolved questions, sealed doors, and catastrophes that were never fully repaired. Part 5. The Veil and the Resurrection Stone. A theory. Before we close, there is one theory worth examining at length, because it sits at the junction of several things we have discussed, and because it has, I think, the ring of something that might be true. The Deathly Hallows are 3 objects created according to legend, and supported to a meaningful degree by the evidence by death itself, or by 3 extraordinarily powerful magical brothers, or both, depending on how literally you read the tale. The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility. Each hallow addresses one of the 3 fundamental desires that human beings have always felt when confronting their mortality. The desire to overpower death, the desire to undo death, and the desire to escape death. The Resurrection Stone does not undo death. This is a common misreading of its functions. It does not restore the dead to life in any full sense. What it does is bring the dead to the boundary. It draws them back, not across it, not into full living presence, but to the near side of whatever the veil opens onto, close enough to be perceived, close enough to speak, close enough to make the experience of loss sharper and more present, rather than, as you might hope, resolved. The veil, we have established, is a permanent opening in that boundary. Things pass through it and do not come back. It draws across the full threshold, not to the near side. Now consider. The Resurrection Stone and the veil appear to operate on the same structure, the same membrane between living and dead, from 2 different directions. The stone reaches across from this side. The veil opens from this side and permits passage to the other. They are not the same mechanism, but they are working the same seam. The theory proposes this, that the veil is in origin the counterpart object to the Resurrection Stone, that where the stone was crafted, or given to make the dead accessible to the living, the veil or the archway it is held in was crafted or created to make the dead permanently inaccessible, to seal the boundary in one direction, to give death a threshold that could not be crossed back. If this is true, then the veil is not merely a found object that the Department of Mysteries happened to discover and build a room around. It is a made thing, a crafted object of the same order of magical ambition and consequence as the Hallows. Its maker or its creation context is unknown. Its purpose, to permanently close the living world to the return of the dead, except through the inadequate eco-function of the stone, is a statement of enormous philosophical weight. It means that death is meant to be permanent, not by physical necessity. The stone demonstrates that the membrane can be approached from both sides, but by design. Something decided, or the universe arranged itself, so that death would not be easily reversible. The veil exists to enforce this, and the Department of Mysteries, unknowingly or knowingly, built a room around the universe's enforcement mechanism for permanent death. They put it in an amphitheater. They scheduled it for study. They assigned Unspeakables to listen to the voices through it and write reports. Whether this should be regarded as extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily unwise depends, I think, on who you are. Epilogue: the work that never finishes. Here is what I want you to consider as sleep comes for you and the voices through the veil grow very faintly. Present at the edges of the dark. The Department of Mysteries is not a mystery because it is hiding things from you. It is a mystery because the things inside it are genuinely mysterious, not in the colloquial sense of strange or unfamiliar, but in the original sense, belonging to the category of that which cannot, by its nature, be fully known. Death cannot be fully known, because to fully know it you would have to cross the veil. Time cannot be fully known, because to fully know it you would have to stand outside of it. Love cannot be fully known, because to fully know it, to reduce it to mechanism and force and quantifiable effect, would be to misunderstand it in some fundamental way, to capture the butterfly, and then wonder why it no longer flies. The Unspeakables have been working on these problems since before the Ministry of Magic existed. They will be working on them long after the current ministry and all its successors are gone. The bell jar will cycle. The hummingbird will hatch and age and return. The voices through the veil will murmur on in a wind that blows from nowhere, and somewhere in the Department of Mysteries, in a room that is not on the maps and is not discussed in any record you will ever be permitted to read. An unspeakable sits very still at a desk by lamplight and writes down a question, not an answer. A question, careful, precise, perfectly phrased, aimed at the very center of something that does not want to be aimed at. And across the corridor, something ancient and cold and patient and very, very old waits behind a locked door for the door to open. It is, after all, only a matter of time. The Department of Mysteries does not ask to be understood. It does not put a sign on its door, does not publish its findings, does not hold conferences at which the brightest magical minds of the age compare, notes over canapes and politely argue about methodology. It simply persists. Level 9. The Black Corridor. The circular room that turns and loses you, that takes your sense of direction the moment you enter it, as though the building itself is making a point about the kind of knowledge you are here to pursue. You cannot navigate it the way you navigate other things. You cannot proceed confidently. You must choose a door and step through it and discover, every time, with fresh uncertainty, where you are and what you have entered. This is the final thing the Department of Mysteries teaches. Not a fact, not a date, not a recorded catastrophe or a sealed experiment or a theory about the physical nature of love. It teaches a posture, the posture of genuine inquiry. Uncertainty held with steadiness, not knowing held without collapse. The willingness to stand at the boundary of what is known and peer past it, not because you are certain of what you will find, but because the alternative, turning away, building walls, deciding that some questions are not for you, is its own kind of death. The Unspeakables are not brave in the storybook sense. They are not heroes. They have made terrible mistakes. They have caused catastrophes they could not repair, and justified them with the language of necessity and the long view. They have studied suffering, and sometimes, perhaps, extended it in the name of understanding it. They are complicated, and often wrong, and probably dangerous, and almost certainly indispensable. They are, in other words, what the pursuit of the most difficult knowledge always produces. People who have gone far enough in that direction that they cannot fully come back. who carry the cold of that corridor with them wherever they go, who hear, in quiet moments, the faint suggestion of voices that are neither quite present nor quite absent. If you have ever sat with a question you couldn't answer, if you have ever looked at the night sky and felt the specific vertigo of genuinely not knowing what is out there, or picked up a stone and thought about everything it has outlasted, or watched someone sleep and felt the strangeness of consciousness as something that clearly exists and yet resists every effort to explain it. If you have ever stood at a threshold and felt the difference between here and there, without being able to say precisely what made them different, you have had, briefly and safely, and without any professional consequence, the experience of standing in the corridor of the Department of Mysteries. That feeling belongs in a room. The Unspeakables built the rooms. Sleep well. The corridor is quiet tonight. The veil stirs in its windless wind. And somewhere in the dark that is deeper than dark, something that might be a thought, and might be a memory, and might be neither of those things, rests just on the other side of the only door that has never been opened from this direction. It waits, as it has always waited, with extraordinary patience, because it has nothing but time